record. Okay, so welcome everybody to the first of a three-part series on writing your first or maybe second or third grant for NIH funding. So this is a series that the Network on Life Course Health Dynamics and Disparities is putting on. I'm also monitoring the chat room, sorry. So today's session, we'll hear from Amelia Karakar, who's a program officer at NIA, who I think everybody on the call knows quite well. And so in this first session, Amelia will, she's prepared an awesome presentation. I've seen it, and prepared, information that we all wondered about, when we're preparing our first submission. So when do we contact a program officer? How do we get started? What are the, the main points of confusion that we all suffer, through the getting to know the NIH process. So Amelia is going to present. It's going to be very interactive, lots of Q&A. Thanks to everybody who submitted your questions ahead of time. After today, you will, if you're on the network's listserv, you'll get an email asking you to express your interest in subsequent parts of the grant mentoring program. The next part two, will take place in January. That part will focus on supplements. So how do you find supplements to existing grants? When's the right stage in your career to write a supplement, whether it's a diversity supplement or administrative supplement? So we'll have a session focused on that. We'll have some folks who are very good at getting supplements, talk about how they do it, as well as hear from some other folks from NIA on some pointers on how to be successful with supplement applications. And then the third part of the program will take place in February. And what we'll do in February is basically we're repeating what we do every summer, which is offer a grant mentoring program, which is more hands-on, more individualized. And this is for those of you who already have a specific aims page drafted. You've got an idea that's pretty well crystallized, and you want some, individualized hands-on mentoring to spruce up that specific aims page and make it more competitive. So you'll be getting emails next week about those next two parts of the program. So I'm going to turn it over to Bob Hummer to introduce Amelia and get us started on how to get your first NIH grant.
Thanks, Jennifer. Yeah, I'm Bob Hummer, also one of the co-PIs of the network that Jennifer's talking about, in collaboration also with Jennifer Ailshire and Sarah Bergard, who are also on the webinar today. So anyway, I'm very pleased to introduce Amelia Karakar, who I've gotten to know well over the last 3 or 4 years, as in collaboration with the work we are doing together with NIA-funded projects, including this network. Amelia, it was interesting to go back into her background, was an NIA pre-doctoral trainee at the University of Wisconsin when she was doing her PhD work there in sociology, and then did a NIA-funded postdoc as well at the University of Michigan, before moving on to academia at Iowa State University, and then moving to the NIA a few years ago, where she's currently a program official in the Division of Behavioral and Social Research in the National Institute on Aging. Beyond being a wonderfully responsive and responsible and just fantastic person to work with at NIA, I've also come to appreciate Amelia just as just a fantastic person, and someone who I just really enjoy spending time with and working with, and so forth. She will, comes to this presentation, the presentation is going to be fantastic, as Jennifer mentioned, great slides, but also fun along the way. Amelia has also asked that we, want to break in with questions. She doesn't want to just talk for 40 or 60 minutes or what have you. So please, along the way, we'll break in. The PIs will break in with questions or clarifying. points or what have you, please do send questions to the chat box, which we'll monitor along the way. And we'll try to intersperse those along the way. There will be time at the end, of course, but Amelia would really prefer to have this kind of as a go back and forth kind of event as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to Amelia. And again, thank you for joining us today and giving us your insights on all of these issues in terms of preparing NIH grant applications.
Thanks a lot, Bob. And thanks everybody for joining me. Can you see my slides? Yeah. Yes, but you also don't see the like blob of video. That's not there. Okay, great. So like Bob said, please interrupt. I think of interrupting as active listening. So please send your questions as they come up or if something's not clear. I really appreciate Jennifer and Bob collecting the questions you sent in advance. I'll try really hard to address, I think almost all of them in the presentation, but please don't be shy. So today I'm going to talk about preparing your first or second or whatever NIH application. Just to start off, one of the things that I think is potentially daunting about NIH and sometimes maddening is that there is a lot of terminology that we use that outside folks may not be familiar with. I know this was the case for me when I started working at NIH. So we'll talk about ICs. Those are NIH institutes or centers. There are 27 at the National Institutes of Health. The National Institute on Aging is one. NICHD, which you might be familiar with, is another. The Fogarty International Center, which handles a lot of international research, is another. And this matters because different ICs have different policies and participate in different initiatives. So it's useful to know that these are distinctions to be made. Another term that I hear folks use a lot is they talk about what mechanism should I use when I'm applying. When we talk about mechanisms at NIH, we mean either a grant, which is most relevant probably for this group, cooperative agreements or contracts. Grants and cooperative agreements are assistance mechanisms where basically NIH is giving the investigator money for their idea to execute that idea. In the case of a grant, NIH is not really involved in the execution of those goals. Cooperative agreement, there's a little bit more engagement with program, but really when we're talking about mechanisms, we're talking mostly for this, mostly talking about grants. Really, I think a lot of times what people mean when they talk about a mechanism is an activity code. So you might hear someone talking about preparing your first R01. There were some questions about R01s versus R21s versus R03s, K award applications. These are what we call activity codes. And different activity codes have different budgets associated with them, different project periods, how long you have for the grant, different purposes. So the R stands for, in my mind, research, versus say the K award applications are typically used for career training. And there's some other activity codes as well, but these are some of the ones that are probably most relevant for this group. And then you may hear folks talk within NIH about FOAs, funding opportunity announcements. Every time that you submit an application to NIH, it will come through a specific funding opportunity announcement. And there are a bunch of different types of FOAs, and it behooves you to understand the differences because it can influence where things are reviewed, whether there's money that's set aside for a particular topic, and other things that you need to pay attention to when you're submitting.
Amelia, can I jump in here, like
Yep.
on this FOA point, just to make sure, like we don't have to wait for those kind of announcements to submit something, right? Like those, I've always thought of those as like advertisements, basically, but like unsolicited applications are the majority, right?
That's an awesome point, Bob. So yes, and actually, what we call these unsolicited or maybe apparent announcement is typically a PA that you would see here. So I think something like 80% of the applications that NIH receives are investigator initiated, where they're not on a particular topic. It's you guys come up with, and NIH recognizes that researchers are really good at coming up with, you know, the innovative cutting edge science. So, you know, these parent announcements are for folks who it's not on a particular topic, but it's an R01 on something. Is that helpful? And those are always, there's always a parent FOA that's active, say for an R01 or an R21 or R03. So those are always going on. But some of these other specific ones, like, for example, RFAs, those may only be active for a very discrete amount of time.
Okay, perfect, thank you.
Amelia, can I ask a question? I don't know if you're going to get to this, but about like, how do people find out about these announcements? And like, I am subscribed to some email list and I get weekly, you know what I'm talking about? Yeah, can you talk about that?
Sure can. So a few sort of big points, like if you take away anything from this talk, the first, and this is maybe a little bit, NIH is a federal governmental organization. And because we are as such, almost everything that you would want to know is publicly available. There's a lot of stuff that's available on the web. So I've just included a few of the hyperlinks here, but I've also, my understanding is all of this will be shared after the presentation, the whole presentation deck. So you can look at all this stuff later. You don't have to screenshot or scribble down on a receipt. But this NIH guide, which I think you were talking about, Jennifer, there's a digest. Actually, it comes out every Friday. So when we get off this call, some of us might have a treat in our inbox. The NIH guide is where all of the FOAs, new FOAs, or changes in policies are announced. And it's really a good way to understand sort of what's happening in terms of particular funding opportunity announcements on specific topics. So that's one way to find out about FOAs. But another way, which is sort of the third big point for today, is program officers can be a tremendous resource for helping you through the funding process. And part of that is helping you identify candidate FOAs, talking through pros and cons of particular funding opportunity announcements. I mean, like I said, you have to submit through an FOA, but you often have some choice and there may be some strategy about that. And that's really something that we can do. So I think joining, subscribing to the guide is something that's helpful to sort of see the kinds of things that are coming out. Policy, changes in NIH policy are also communicated through the guide. But those I would say are sort of a couple of the big ways, the guide and through program folks. And the third thing I wanted to say is that some policies vary by institute. So the things that I'm saying today, much of it is relevant across IC's institutes, but some of it is specific to NIA uniquely. And so it's useful to keep that in mind. So you may talk to a program officer in NIA like myself, but your research may also be relevant, especially for this group, for say NICHD, Child Health and Human Development. So some of the things that, for example, K award applications are reviewed within NIA's own review branch. However, NICHD, those are reviewed in standing study sections, and we'll talk more about that. But that's a difference between different institutes. Different institutes have different pay lines, they have different funding priorities, and they may differ in terms of participating in particular FOAs. Almost every institute participates in those parent FOAs, but I know, for example, folks had asked about R21s versus R03s and R01s. Not every institute I know participates in the R21. So it's useful to sort of know who's participating in what and what what their particular mission is. Did anybody want to jump in with questions or comments about any of this?
Nothing specific in the chat box right now. Please send them if you have them. Some agreement on your point that, you know, terminology at NIH is like, it's really difficult to learn, but
it's an alphabet soup, and it's still hard. Like somebody mentioned CDEs the other day, which, as you said, Bob, I was at Wisconsin for my PhD. CDE for me was the Center for Demography and Ecology. CDE is also at NIH a lot of times Common Data Elements. So it always continues. But so just to elaborate on this last sort of big takeaway about when to talk to a program officer, we're really here to help, and we're here to help you navigate the NIH funding process. But one thing that a sort of first tip that for making these interactions really effective is to do your homework. So if you're thinking about, you know, a particular, you have an idea about whether it's an R01 or an R21, maybe you don't know which one it is, and part of the process is talking that through with the PO. You know, do what you can to sort of educate yourself about a particular funding opportunity announcement, about the mission of the Institute. That goes a long way. The next step is to prepare a specific aims page, and we'll talk more about that on the next slide. I've also shared some resources from NIAID. It burns me up that it's not NIA that has these great preparing your application resources, but credit where credit is due. You can go to the NIAID website, and the link is on the last slide. They actually have example specific aims pages, example applications. They're about allergies and infectious diseases, which may be relevant to some life course inequality types of things they're interested in. But those are really helpful for us as program officers to get a handle on what it is that you'd like to do. Like I said, once you sort of have some idea of what it is you want to do, then it's time to talk, or really preferably, I would say, email a program official or a program officer. Those terms are often used interchangeably. Also health scientist administrator, but they're all sort of effectively the same in terms of our role of helping you. So it's time to talk to a PO, potentially when you have an idea on paper, but you don't know maybe if it's NIA or NICHD that would be most interested in it. Or maybe there were some questions about, you know, do I need to apply for an R03 before I go for an R01? That's the sort of thing that we can help talk through with you. Maybe you're ready to submit. You want to submit your first R01. But you want some broad feedback about what the aims page looks like. Maybe you're not actually sure which FOA you should submit to. You know, you might want to know what our ideas are about study section or potential concerns that maybe we see come up in particular study sections. And this last situation, which probably doesn't apply to most first-time applicants, but if you have a large application with a large budget of $500,000 in direct costs in any year, you would need advance permission. Once you've submitted and your work has been reviewed, it's time to chat with us potentially again after the summary statement is issued. The first question people have is am I going to get funded? And the answer is usually, I don't know. But it's, you know, could be helpful to talk through the review, the comments that appeared in the summary statement, chatting about, you know, how to address them, et cetera, things like that. And then hopefully this will be all of you very soon, if not already, after your award is made. And maybe you want to update us on a great paper that came out. Maybe you're thinking about a supplement or a renewal for a project. And I know you're going to chat a lot about supplements in the next session.
So quick, Amelia, just clarification, for summary statements are basically the reviews. That's for just language lingo, NIH lingo.
Sorry, yes.
Yeah, summary statements means reviews.
Yeah, a written record of when a study section, when a group of people like the PIs on this project and the members of this network get together, they read applications, they assign numerical scores, and to evaluate the scientific impact and merit of the work. The summary statement is the written record of that review.
Amelia, can I ask a question about the first bullet point here about knowing the right IC or activity code? So I think, you know, if I know that my project is probably for NIA, you know, I'm not sure, do I contact you? Do I contact Georgianne, somebody else, or do I put all of you on an email? And then the second part of that question is, you know, like what happens behind the scenes? Let's say you look at my specific aims page and you think, well, it's probably better suited for NICHD. You know, do you then contact somebody at NICHD, you know, your counterpart there, or do you send me to them? How does that work?
Yeah, so I guess the first part of the question is sort of which, you go to the NIA website, you go to the Division of Behavioral and Social Research, you look at staff, which of us do you send an email to? There is, I think, lists of our portfolio areas, and I didn't include that here because it does evolve over time. But there's sort of some broad descriptions of our portfolios. If you email any of us, it will eventually find the right person. And I guess I would say, now being on this side of it, if you don't hear immediately, maybe wait a few days and send another email, because just like everybody else, we get a lot of email, and it doesn't mean it's not important, but you know, at least I never am annoyed to get a nudge on something. Regarding the sort of different, I mean, when we take a look at the aims, if we think maybe it's more relevant for NICHD, it might depend on the particular program officer. I would probably copy a colleague at NICHD if it's, say, on racial or ethnic health disparities in, you know, childhood, which should go to NICHD. Probably, you know, I would email my colleague, Dr. Juanita Chin, and say, you know, I think you can take, maybe you should take a look at this and copy the PI, but different folks may do that differently. Does that answer your questions?
It does. Thank you.
And if I could just add to that, program officers often attend scientific conferences. So I've had a lot of interactions with program officers at the annual gerontology meeting. And also our program officers like Georgianne, Pat Meos, and Amelia often come to our network meeting, which we didn't have last year and we won't have next year, but we will have a PAA meeting again, and we'll have a network meeting. And John Haga used to come to our network meetings. And so I think that there are a lot of fruitful opportunities to chat with program officers at conferences. And those are good times to just, like, if you don't really know who to talk to, you can chat up a program officer. And Amelia, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're there to talk to people, right? You're mingling amongst the common folk for that exact reason.
Yes, I stepped down from my glamorous bureaucratic perch. It's more of like a, you know, a little cabinet somewhere. But I would also say, if you're not sure, you know, I know many of you, I don't know all of you from various ways, shoot me an email. I'll put it and drop it in the chat, and I'll make sure that you end up finding the correct person. Okay, so the specific aims page. So, and I would say too, I mean, part of doing your homework is, you know, committing something to paper. And that's helpful for me as a program officer. I don't usually agree to meet with people if they don't have something written down, because it's hard for me to prepare if I don't know what it is that I'm reacting to. I have some time to think about it. I really hope there's actually a lot of other people chime in on this one, because you're the ones that actually write these and review them. But so the specific aims page is a single page that outlines your application's significance, hypotheses, data, and methods at a high level. So this is really, I don't know, sometimes I think about it as sort of like if, you know, you were supposed to come up with like an elevator speech for your dissertation. It's kind of like that in a single written page. It's a sort of holistic whole of everything that you're going to do, this gestalt. For many reviewers, this may be the only part of their application that they actually look at, if that. So it's useful to spend a lot of time on it because it's one of the things, and reviewers, please chime in and correct me if I'm wrong, that they use to develop their you know, impressions of the project. Sometimes people ask, you know, how many aims should I have? I mean, you know, should there be, you know, 3 magical aims? Not necessarily. I mean, the number of aims should match your the activity code. So an R01 is maybe up to 5 years. You know, it might make sense to have more aims for an R01 than for a 2-year R03. I wouldn't say that's like a hard and fast rule, but you know, I'd say the sort of basic, I'd say, you know, tip here is to do less better. A lot of times in review, so I'm not a reviewer, but I listen to a lot of reviews. It's far preferable to have 2 good aims that you are able to elaborate on in the rest of the application than to have 3 so-so aims. I've seen it happen time and time again where a reviewer will say, I loved aims 1 and 2, but aim 3 just didn't make any sense. And, you know, it seems that that ends up having an impact on the ultimate score. But other folks, what do you want to add about specific aims pages to put you on the spot?
Yeah, to me, this is a great summary. Just a little bit as from a reviewer perspective, like this drives everything. That the aims page drives everything. So how the rest of the application will unfold, you know, why is it important? How is it innovative? How are you going to do it, and so forth, is driven by this aims page. And as a reviewer, when I sit down to read these things, I read the aims page. And at that point, it's either like, I'm excited, I can't wait to read the rest of this, and like, this is gonna really help push science forward, or like, oh God, I gotta read the rest of this thing, and you know, it's, you know, I'm gonna just be tired and upset and so forth. So, you know, when I write these things, I spend so much time on the specific aims page. It's the first thing I write, but constantly revising it and tweaking it, perfecting it, because it literally does drive everything else. So I'll stop there, but that just reiterates what you had already said. There's a point in that Sarah Bergard, I don't know if you should have co-host, but anyway, Sarah said it's really useful to show your aims page to lots of trusted senior advisors to get feedback. And
that's a great point too. I mean, don't just show them to us, show them to people, people that you trust, but also people who don't necessarily do what you do. So the group of people who review your science on the study section. So for example, a lot of folks in here, appropriate study section, and we're lucky enough to have, I think, at least one study section member on the call. Social science and what is it? Social studies. It's social science and SSPS. I forget what it stands for because it's Friday afternoon. But a lot of people may be reading this who aren't in your area. So it's really important. They may not say, of course, education is my favorite independent variable. Of course, like this is important. It may be somebody who does environmental health, or they do housing policy or something. Like you have to be able to convey the broad scientific impact for a group of people who might not already be on your side. Jennifer Alshire.
Yeah, I unmuted myself to agree with that point. And also I review for NIAS, which is it's a special emphasis panel that Amelia pointed out. NIA is one of the agencies, one of the institutes that does special review for all of the career awards. And I would say the disciplinary and research diversity in NIAS is even more than what it is in SSPA and B. So there aren't actually very many population, what I would call and consider population scientists like we have in the NLCHDD network. So you have, like, you really have to pique the enthusiasm of people who are like clinical psychologists or, I mean, we have a lot of qualitative researchers in NIAS also. So I think it's super important for any review. It's especially important for a study section like NIAS. And if you're interested in the disciplinary diversity of a reviewer pool, you can look up the study section rosters to see, and they're not, you're looking at prior rosters, they're not set in stone, they change a bit over time, but it gives you a sense of who's going to be reviewing your application.
I think that's one of the sort of helpful links at the end that'll be shared is places for you to look up. There's actually a matchmaking tool, so you can enter, I think, your title or your abstract and, you know, sing Fiddler on the Roof, and it will suggest some particular study sections. But a sort of good rule of thumb is for it's a request. NIH ultimately determines where it's reviewed. Is do you recognize the names of people on that study section? That is a good indicator that maybe you're looking in the right place. Did anyone else?
I was just going to add a little something, Amelia. Thanks so much for this. It's just super helpful. And I was thinking back to the first couple times I wrote a proposal, and the Ames page is not just like a bit like a what is that called? A table of contents, right? This is actually like where you do your sales pitch. And so I think what I was focused on when I was first writing these was like showing that I had my academic credentials right. And so I cite everybody important and all this stuff, but you get a lot of room to do the appropriate hand waving toward the appropriate people in your field in the background section. And the Ames, you know, you need to know, like, you know what you're talking about, but it's really about talking about the so what and sort of going big with, this is why you should care about this grant. You know, this is what's not known, this is what's missing, this is the thing we're going to be able to do once we address these aims. There has to be more of that element to it than I was initially thinking, because you are trying to convince a bunch of folks who don't care about the minutia of your super tiny subfield, right? Or don't understand them. So you kind of have to make a more of a pitch for people, and it's a very different skill than writing a paper, right? There is a little bit of that aspect when you write a paper to a generalist journal. In the introduction, you have to kind of have a big tent approach and sort of say, here's this big social problem, and then the paper kind of gets narrower as you go. And I think that there's some of the same of that in the Ames page being that broader base of trying to draw people in and organize their thinking about what you're going to do and set expectations. But you can get into kind of more of the very more academic minutia in the middle part of the proposal. And it was helpful for me to think about that every time I put an Ames page together.
That's a great point. Yeah. One of the things I would add, and maybe other folks who are reviewers could comment on this, is in terms of the actual application, the things that tend to drive the score, more than anything else, it's the approach. If you're applying to you're using a particular activity code like an R01, approach is really that's one of the review criteria. And you would see this actually when you look in the particular funding opportunity announcements, what the reviewers are instructed to look for. But approach is really the methods that you're using, the data that you're using, how you're dealing, you know, do you have power calculations if those are required? Can you do what you say you're going to do? Like, it's sort of like, you know, should you do it is the significance question, and then can you do it well? And that's the approach question. And I think there's some quantitative work to back this up, but that's my understanding of sort of what tends to drive the ultimate scores on applications. So as I said, anytime you apply to NIH, you're going to submit through a specific funding opportunity announcement. And just to emphasize, when you're choosing between a funding opportunity announcement, read the entire thing carefully. I mean, read the slide carefully, but it doesn't really matter. Read the FOA carefully, because there's all kinds of information in there that's really important. So first of all, maybe you're doing something on, is NIA participate in it? A particular institute may decide not to join every funding opportunity announcement. Are you eligible to apply? So this is especially important, say, if you're thinking about various K award applications. Do you have, the right credentials to do the work? When is the application due? There are what we call standard due dates that apply for a lot of stuff, but then there are some special due dates for specific FOAs. When does the FOA expire? You can only submit to an FOA that's active. So they become inactive over time. So that's something to consider. What is the budget that's allowed? What's the project period? Is this something that, you're allowed to spend up to 5 years doing, like typically an R01, or is it like an R03 where, I should specify, activity codes are linked within the FOA, but it just can be helpful to think about all of these sorts of key pieces of information that are within that FOA. So Bob had mentioned like the parent R01, or what we call investigator initiated topics. So I just listed PA 20-185. This is the active parent R01. So if you have a great idea for an R01, maybe we don't have anything specifically on that topic, but this would be what you would submit to. So that's one, when you see PA, that's one use for that particular denotation. PAs can also be used, I think, Bob, you also said this, as sort of like an FYI to the research community. It can be like, hey, we're interested in this particular topic. We'd love it if you would submit on it. But part of why I wanted to break these down is because there are, I would say, different incentives to apply to particular types of FOAs. So the second I wanted to list here was the PAR. So I think of the R as standing for review. This is an FOA where typically there is a special review panel that's been convened to review applications on a particular topic. And there may be special responsiveness criteria. So what I mean by that is, say it's a topic, it's about, bringing together two fields that maybe don't work together very often. And so we need to put together a special review panel that matches this expertise to review these applications. So an advantage for a PAR might be the review expertise is better than maybe you would get in a standing study section. But there also may be some specific responsiveness criteria that you need to pay attention to. So for example, the NIH data sharing policy is evolving, but there may be something very specific in this PAR that says in order to be responsive, to basically come into this, you need to do the following thing. So this is just to help reiterate that point, to read all of the text of the FOA carefully. So the carrot you can think of sort of here is potentially special expertise in terms of review. There's also a PAS, and I think of the S as a $sign. A PAS in your mind, your brain should light up, because S means dollars, it means set aside funds. So what I mean by that is, assuming that we receive, we being the institute or some other entity, if we receive meritorious applications, we will pay them. We have money that we have set aside for this topic. So you see a PAS, you might, in the NIH guide, you may say, maybe I want to take a closer look at this, because, if they get good stuff, they're going to pay it probably. Last sort of the big ones here is an RFA. And this is typically how a lot of programming happens within NIA, I would say. So in this case, it's sort of the PAR and the PAS together. So there's set aside money, and there's also usually a special review or responsiveness criteria. So a very specific example of one that just happened or expired a few years ago was this AG 18-011. And I think we have at least 2 grantees that were funded out of this on this call. And this was a call to understand why socioeconomic disparities in health outcomes have been growing over the past several decades. So the applications came in, there was only one due date. So you see RFA, you might look really carefully and see if it's something that maybe is appropriate for you. But these applications were reviewed by a special review panel, and then we spent money on them. So I feel like I haven't been explaining this in the most coherent way, but I'm almost done. The last point I just wanted to mention was a NOC, which is a notice of special interest, which is also sort of like a PA in the first case here of the sort of FYI sense. So I linked to a NOC about looking at sex and or gender differences in Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. So for us, it was saying, we're interested in this topic. We'd love it if you would submit, but there's no special money for this explicitly. So the NOC and the PA are the sort of FYIs. The PAR, the PAS, and the RFA have some carrots that are attached to. And I would always encourage you, if there's something with a set aside, to think carefully about whether it's appropriate. Other folks wanna jump in about FOAs?
So I don't know if this is getting too advanced, Amelia, but another terminology for NIH is the idea of pickups. Would you say that the NOCs might indicate when program would pick up an application? Or like how to, I'm never quite sure how the NOSIs work or how people should react to those.
What do you mean pick up? Like,
so as program officers, you all meet at your funding meetings and you make decisions about funding applications, even funding out of order or applications that didn't necessarily get like a score that one might think is fundable. And that sometimes is determined based on programmatic priorities, right? And do these NOSIs reflect those priorities?
they can. I guess I would say that funding out of order, especially more than a few sort of units out of the funding line, is something that very rarely happens. The summary statement, the scores that we receive from reviewers are really they're the basis for making recommendations about funding, and at least within NIA, those are adhered to pretty strongly. We can use discretionary funds for some things, although the pools of discretionary money are limited. I wouldn't say NOCs are especially special. I don't know if that gets at what you're saying yet. I mean, I guess a general point I would make is write the most compelling scientific application that you can. Part of our job as a program officer is to help you or suggest the right home for that application. So saying like, you know, NIA is interested in Alzheimer's disease. That's something we'll talk about in a little while. Don't go after, you know, Alzheimer's disease money just because NIA said they were interested in it. I mean, you know, for no other reason, you know, write the best application that you can write, and, you know, we'll help you try to figure out the best home for it.
Amelia, one last question for me on this page. Thank you for the explanation of these. Going back to the top one, the PA, the example you give is for an R01. Are there similar PAs then for R21 and R03, K01, what all these things? So there would be a PA for each of those kinds of applications.
Yes, that's true for almost all of the activity codes that people would use, but not all of them. So for example, the U01, a cooperative agreement, I don't believe NIA participates in a investigator-initiated U01. But most of the activity codes that you would be interested in using have sort of what we call the, you know, the parent version, where it's not on a particular topic, and, you know, folks generally submit to those.
Okay, so would it be safe to say then that once somebody writes a specific Ames page and they talk to you and talk to their colleagues and so, okay, I'm going for a R01, then you go to this PA 2185 and just know that document and paste it on your wall and follow that. That's like your guide. Then is that fair to say?
If that's the FOA that is the best fit, yeah.
Okay.
And that's what most of them are going to be. I mean, your default could always be the parent announcement unless you see something juicier come along.
Great, thank you. Yeah.
Okay, so I just mentioned Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease, addressing various aspects of Alzheimer's disease, everything from detection and developing treatments, understanding social predictors and health disparities therein, to supporting current caregivers. These are high priority topics for actually for NIH, but NIA specifically. And to reflect the scientific priority, there is a different budgetary allocation for research that is deemed relevant for Alzheimer's disease. Actually, that's a great other thing to talk about with a program officer is this work relevant for Alzheimer's disease? And I think I forgot to include this, but there's a nice NIA blog post about how to sort of tailor your application to make sure that it's clear that it's relevant for Alzheimer's disease. Somebody asked about pay lines. If you Google NIA, NIH, pay line FY 2021, I should say our fiscal year starts October 1st. So we're now in fiscal year 2021 at NIH. You'll be able to pull this up. And I think I included it in our slides, but basically just wanted to show you sort of what one of our pay lines is right now. So this is for applications that are reviewed at the Center for Scientific Review. So like if you have, say you came in for a parent, you submitted to that parent R01, you'd probably be reviewed at SSPS, let's say, and your application gets an impact score, and that impact score is percentiled. The percentile on that summary statement is what would be used as sort of a preliminary funding guideline for whether it would be funded or not. And so what you see here is this sort of first column, the general pay line for what we call regular size or smaller applications. So those are less than $500,000 in direct costs, total costs. What you see right now, and don't freak out, but the current pay line is we're paying up generally to the 8th percentile in general. However, if you're a new investigator and you've never had an R01 before and you are submitting an R01, the percentile that we're paying up to is the 11th. If you are an early stage investigator, so you're an investigator who's never had an R01, who never has had an R01 before and is applying for an R01, and you're also within 10 years of your terminal degree, we're paying up to the 13th percentile. The general pay line, just for this middle column for these large applications, I think the takeaway is that it's harder to get more expensive applications are harder to get funded. So the bar is especially high. That's probably not relevant for most early stage or sort of folks who are beginning in NIH land. However, drawing attention here to this ADRD pay line. So applications that are relevant for Alzheimer's disease, we're paying currently up to about the 25th percentile. So 25th percentile versus 8th percentile. It's clear that there is a tremendous funding advantage for work that's relevant to Alzheimer's disease. And this is for NIA. So again, some of the information I share is for NIA specifically. This is one of those pieces. So just to show you, and this is one of the things to talk about with the program officers, maybe you have an interest in Alzheimer's disease. You know, do they have tips on sort of how to clarify the relevance of that so that you could qualify, say, for this funding line? Does anyone want to comment? I know several folks on the call have been funded for Alzheimer's disease relevant work or about pay lines in general.
Pay lines in general make that they ebb and flow, right? I mean, even within fiscal years as well as across, right?
Like the phases of the moon, Bob, I will say that they get, the funding lines tend to become a little more generous as the fiscal year progresses. You can imagine we have three sort of general funding cycles a year that correspond to our advisory councils. You wouldn't want to, you know, we don't know what's going to come in later in the year, so you don't want to necessarily pay everything maybe you possibly could up front. So I would expect that these funding lines will become a little more, I don't know if you want to call it generous as the year goes on. The other consideration right now is that we're operating under a continuing resolution. So the funding lines, I would say, are especially conservative right now. However, say you have an application that came in for fiscal year 2021, and you were at you're an early stage you're an early stage investigator, and you wrote an RO1, and you know it's not AD, so, and you're at the 15th percentile. It may be that as the funding line changes, your application may fall within the funding line, and your application sort of remains eligible for funding for 3 funding cycles. So it's sort of still alive, so to speak. So if you're close to the funding line, but you're not funded, and this is the kind of conversation I have with applicants all the time is, you know, maybe you hold tight depending on, you know, other things that are going on in your life, personal and professional. You may want to see just what happens with that funding line, but they do change. So there were a bunch of questions about specific activity codes. So these 3, this single letter and then 2 numbers after them, which activity codes to use for particular things. So a lot of folks, if you're doing research, you'll be submitting to something in the R series. So maybe an R01 or an R21 or an R03. What are the things that you should think about in terms of which of these you apply for? I mean, I should have put this, but really the biggest question is sort of what is appropriate given what your specific aims are and what it is that you want to achieve. In terms of sort of how that maps on to the specifics of these activity codes, they have different page limits for research strategy. So for example, you get 12 pages for an R01 versus 6 pages for an R21 or an R03. The budget is very different for an R01. The budget is not unlimited, but basically it's you can apply for an R01 with a budget up to, and you can imagine see a lot of these, as long as it's less than $500,000 in direct costs in all years, you can submit whatever you want to the R01. For the R21, the total budget across the 2 years, it's a 2-year project period, is $275,000. For the R03, it's only $100,000 over 2 years. And this stuff is all online. I apologize. I'm still workshopping these. So really the length of the project is very different. The amount of financial resources, the allowable budget is very different. And also sort of reviewers may have different expectations, and I hope folks will weigh in on this actually. So preliminary data, I believe, is required for an R01, which sort of makes sense. It's a larger project. There's, potentially longer project period involved and more money. Preliminary data really, folks often think about is, maybe you're using an instrumental variable to examine a causal effect of something on something. Maybe you present the first stage of that analysis as preliminary data. Other kinds of things reviewers may sort of, I guess, would have higher standards or higher expectations for R01s versus R21s or R03s. But I don't know if folks wanted to weigh in on that in terms of, as a reviewer, how you think about these different codes. They are usually reviewed as blocks together. So all the R01s from experienced investigators like Bob are reviewed in a clump. Then all the R01s for new investigators, early stage investigators, are reviewed in a clump. Then all the R21s and all the R03s. But Bob, did you want to, or others want to say something about these?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify one point in that chat that was asked. The 500K refers to per year for an R01,
Yes.
right? So over 5 years, it could be a $2.5 million direct cost application, just to clarify that.
Without permission. You can submit a larger application than that, but you need advance permission from NIA to do so.
And the second part that I just wanted to just pick your brain a little bit on this, because it's a huge difference to going up to 2.5 million in direct cost for an R01 over 5 years in comparison to like an R03, 2 years, 100K. Is there any disadvantage that you've seen for like newer investigators to apply for 5 years, 2.5? Is like, as a reviewer, I'd be like, as a reviewer, I'd be a little skeptical. Someone's only got a couple of publications and then they want 5 years and $2.5 million. And it's like, even with a good idea, I'm like, oh, geez, there's not a track record there. Do you see that as well? Or would you agree with that kind of thinking?
Well, I would listen to you because you're a reviewer, but I would say that, you don't have to be either like 0 or 60. So another thing I actually wanted to say about an R01, there are lots of people who have never had NIH support before who are funded. Their first award is an R01. It's probably not what we would call a $499 special, where it's, they're asking for $999 in all 5 years. And frankly, we see a lot of those, which we're behavioral scientists, like that makes sense. But you don't have to, do it quite that way. And I would also say that, so a lot of people, their first award is an R01. Just going back to the earlier slide, as you see, there's a payline advantage for early stage investigators, but only for R01s. So actually a conversation I have with folks a lot is, maybe they're thinking about, should I do an R21 or should I do an R01? And, it's sort of like, there's some, conceptual flexibility in terms of which you would apply for, but in terms of the incentive structure, if it's appropriate, I generally encourage people to go big and go for the R01. They just need to be careful that they realize, that the expectations of reviewers may be higher. I know I'm going to undercut what I just said, which is, I think, actually, in our sort of experiences listening to reviews, I think sometimes reviewers may hold some of the smaller activity codes, specifically the R03, to a higher standard. So, I guess it's ask for the budget that you need, ask for the time that you need. A lot of people think that it's easier to get funded with an R03 or an R21. I would not say that that is the case. And again, I think that there is some empirical work on that NIAID website that indicates this. And the process seems to be that a lot of people are sort of held to a higher standard. So I forget, did I say this already? You can write an R01 that's secondary data analysis only. Some people, I think that you have to be collecting primary data analysis or doing primary data, collecting your own data, excuse me, Friday afternoon. We see lots of really compelling stuff that's secondary data analysis only. So again, this is sort of part of it. What might be useful about talking with a PO, our program officer, is, is it crazy to apply for an R01 for my first award? I mean, my question would probably be, does it make sense in terms of what your specific aims are and what you'd like to do? Maybe it's not a $4.99 special if it's just you. Put together the appropriate team. Maybe you have a senior person who's a co-I on the project to sort of give you a little bit more support as you're administering your first award. But I hope that's helpful. Jennifer Montez, did you want to say something?
Sure. So I'm one of those really lucky people who was able to get an R01 funded without having had an R03 or R21 ahead of time. Obviously I wasn't there in the review to know how that was possible, but having been in reviews now, the way that reviewers talk about an application like that, an R01 for an early stage investigator, it often comes up, you have a conversation about the team that they've put together. So, do they have very experienced co-investigators or consultants who can kind of, it gives the reviewers a lot more comfort knowing that there are experienced people involved. And in my experience, that's been the main bar, the main hurdle. If you can show that you have that experience on your team, then going straight for an R01, the reviewers are generally okay with that.
Thanks, Jennifer. We got a couple other, Samantha Friedman has a question in person, and then Adam Roth in the chat. So I'll ask Adam, but Samantha, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad, Amelia, you mentioned that about the secondary data analysis. I have a follow-up question on that. If you want to apply to use data through an RDC, what's the best mechanism to do that? Because it sounds like it takes about a year to get, sometimes up to a year to get approval. So what is the timing in applying for, NIH funding while doing the RDC? Do you get the RDC approval and then you apply for the NIH grant, or can you do it simultaneously?
That's a good question. Thanks for raising that. I remember this question came in and I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to weave it into the presentation. I mean, I don't know if anybody else who uses an RDC has any, wants to weigh in. I would imagine it certainly doesn't hurt. With certain types of data, there may be a restriction in terms of you can't actually get the data until you have support for it. But I think having everything that you can in line already to demonstrate to the reviewers that you can do the work is good to have. And, having access to the data, having worked with the data would be one component of that. Maybe it's, say we're in this situation that Bob and Jennifer talked about, where it's maybe a junior PI with a first R01, maybe it's a, strong letter of support from some of the senior folks or from a consultant. Is that helpful? I feel like it's sort of a cop-out because I said it depends, but I think the more you can have in place to give reviewers confidence, the better.
Yeah, I mean, I think if I could just jump in with like the broader framing, reviewers are fairly conservative in their approach, and that's true throughout NIH. And that means it's kind of like what Bob said before. They take a lot of they understand that they're, making funding decisions that impact where taxpayer dollars are going. And I think they want to know, like, can this person pull this off? And I think in the case of your question, you probably want to say that you've got an approved RDC application in place, and maybe you've even already done some work in the RDC, or someone on your team has. Because I think when reviewers get antsy, that's what pushes them from like a 2 to a 3, or right? Like it's that kind of lack of assurance in the application, in my experience on review sections.
Agreed. Yeah,
Thank
thanks.
you.
And Adam Roth had a question about, do reviewers tend to focus on number of years of that applicants have been publishing, or the amount they've published? And maybe I could just start the answer on this, that, I think it's when as a reviewer, when I look at applications, it's probably neither of those. It's just what kind of impact has this person made in terms of the science so far. So there can be people that have 2 publications or 50, but if those 2 publications have really been in high-profile journals and made important impacts, that would be really important, as opposed to 50 publications in low-impact journals that just really haven't done much. So it's, scientific impact. Is there a record that demonstrates that this person has been producing important work? Is the way I would address that. And then maybe a related question a bit is, I want to get Amelia back in. As Carmen Gutierrez wants, when people are putting teams together, Jennifer Montez, it'd be great to hear your expertise on this as well. When people are putting teams together, should the team involve people that have necessarily had NIH grants, or can the team be filled out with people who are experienced in other ways, that maybe don't necessarily have NIH grants, but have other forms of expertise? So maybe, Jennifer, do you want to start the conversation there, and Amelia, with what you've seen with that team building as well?
Sure. So, I mean, just drawing on my experience from sitting in review panels, I think that if this is, your first application to NIH, and reviewers are looking for, the more experienced set of reviewers to kind of, put the safety rails on the application, I do think that they will want to see a record of NIH support from at least one of those other team members.
So I don't know if these questions are coming about R grants or K grants, because I actually think the answers are really quite different.
That's a good point. I was going to say.
Like, I know in the K reviews, people are looking for careers that appear to be ramping up. So if you're 6 years from a PhD and you only have a handful of publications, this particular review panel is pretty harsh with those people. They don't always even look at the quality. And I think that's a disciplinary difference, because I think sociologists tend to think more about quality than quantity. So I don't know what happens on SSP. And I also, for a career mentorate award, you have to have mentors who have NIH funding. I just think you would not ever get a career award through study section if you didn't have mentors with a record of mentoring and a record of funding.
That's a really great segue, if I can. I just wanted to mention briefly K awards. So you may have heard of someone applying for, or you may have or have applied for a K01 or a K99 ROO, a kangaroo, which I know other folks could speak about. But so the R series of activity codes are R is for research, K is for career, but right, we don't spell career with the K. But really sort of the classic example for K awards, or like for say a K01, is you want to write an R01, but there are additional skills that you can acquire in maybe 2 or 3 years that'll get you there. And that's really what the K is. If you can already write the R01, go for the R01. You don't need to go through the K. And what Jennifer said, sort of some of the conversations, I would strongly encourage you, if you're thinking about applying for a K, to talk with a program officer, because like Jennifer Elshire said, the sort of things that reviewers seem to care about and think about are different. And so, for example, having a mentors with strong track records for mentoring and for R01 funding. Actually, that reminds me, somebody had asked a question about What if you have a primary mentor identified for a K, but they're not at your institution? My experience, and Jennifer, I defer to you, is it is okay to have a mentor, a primary mentor, even who's not at your own institution, especially now. I mean, everybody's like in their bathroom, in their kitchen. Is make it very, very clear how you're going to interact with them. And I would say this is something with the K award applications in general, is be painfully explicit about what kind of training you're going to get. If you're going to talk to Bob, are you going to talk to Bob once a week? Is it going to be over Skype if you're not in person? You know, when are you going to put together your committee of Samantha, Sarah, Jennifer, and Bob? You know, really be specific about it. I wonder, I mean, we're living in an extraordinary time, how some of these things will change. Jennifer Alshire, did you want to add anything to since you actually do review Ks?
No, I think your summary is totally spot on.
I think I'm going to skip over the NIH application process from FOA submission through notice of award. You can look at it later, and I think there's like some videos online, which, you know, would be great for this evening, I'm sure. But I guess sort of a big takeaway here would be that it is a limitation of NIH is that the process is slow. From submitting to an FOA to receiving a notice of award, which is really when it's official that you have the money. Actually, it's not you, it's the institution, which is like an aside. And reviewers don't make funding decisions, they evaluate the science as an aside. It's really probably about 9 months at the very fastest, and that's assuming you don't need to resubmit. So this hopefully also drives home the point, talk to your program officer early and often, because it can take quite a while. And this is really, I'd say, optimistic in terms of a timeline.
Amelia, can I jump in for just one point on that? We had one question in the chat about who actually reviews the applications in this process. The question is, does it work like a journal and that reviewers are invited? Who are these three mysterious people who actually score the application, write these reviews? How does that happen? Do you pick them? How does that work?
So there's actually a firewall between program, who makes funding recommendations to the director, and review. But I guess, I don't know if I have time to sort of go into it, but I guess what I would suggest is look at, I think maybe it's even a RATS, it's not, but basically, the study section is a group of, I'd say, I don't know, 15 or so experts in the field who currently hold NIH funding. Your application is assigned to a study section based on the scientific expertise represented on the match between the reviewers and the application. Three of those reviewers, three of the people in the study section are assigned to the application, and those people will read the application and score it. However, say the application is discussed in a review, those three reviewers will talk about the application amongst themselves, particularly sort of what they really liked or what they really didn't like. But everyone in the study section will effectively vote on it or score it. There's some, I don't know, that's not a great way of explaining it.
Well, so Amelia, I don't know if this is still the case because some of the documents changed, but we used to write a cover letter, and now I guess it's part of some other uploadable. I don't know. I don't submit my own grants, so I don't have any idea of what, but it goes to CSR, and the CSR representative makes some decisions. But and I don't know if they always look at it, but like I would say, like, here are like the topics, and then to try to help them match it with the expertise. And I also notified them in advance of any conflicts. But I mean, I often get assigned things that are in my topic area, but I also often get assigned things that are totally not in my topic area. And it may just be that there was there were too many conflicts on the study section roster. And then also it often seems like they're doing a lot of this kind of on the fly. So there's a bit of randomness, I think, in the process too.
Which maybe just to reinforce the point about making sure that your application is written really well. Grantsmanship, I think, does drive the scores to some degree, and that you make clear why it's relevant for people who don't work in your particular subfield. We're almost out of time. I just wanted to briefly, I'll just point you to this. The Division of Behavioral and Social Research, which is my division within the National Institute on Aging, was reviewed last year. And some recommendations were made by a review panel regarding future areas for scientific growth. I just wanted to highlight some of the topics that are mentioned here. Number one, improving understanding of health disparities in aging. This is something that's on our minds every day for a lot of reasons. But I just want to point you, to make you aware of this particular document. Life course processes, aging earlier in the life course, cognitive health, inequalities therein, multidisciplinary perspectives, and macrosocial processes. But maybe I'll stop sharing, and I think everybody will get the presentation.
Thanks so much, Amelia. Yeah, so there's what, 10, 11 minutes for Q&A, other kind of things. I'll continue to monitor the chat. And in the meantime, there was one or two questions that weren't covered here. Could you comment a little bit, based on your experience, or maybe some of the others too, on what you've seen works really well in terms of framing a really good grant proposal in comparison to a paper? Like, is there something that strikes you like this is what really makes a great NIH application that is somewhat different than paper? And Sarah, Jennifer could also weigh in on that, but paper writing versus grant writing.
I guess what I would say is, oh, go ahead, Sarah.
Oh, I can add a little, just having been a reviewer a bunch of times. So one thing that you need to do with both papers and proposals is recognize who your audience is and make their life easy. So when you're writing a paper for a particular journal, you want to give it to them in the format they expect. You want to have the kinds of sections in that paper that they expect to see, that they typically publish, formatting stuff. You want to cite people who have written in that journal before, or in the area that journal really likes. When you're writing a proposal, you have to think about the people reviewing this have a very structured form that they fill out, and they have to rate you numerically on very specific things. So just like Amelia was talking about earlier, there's very specific significance, approach, investigators, innovation. We have to give numeric scores to those. So it is your job to make sure you answer all those things like as clearly as possible, highlight and bold, and make it very easy for people to find the stuff that they're going to have to write about. Obviously you don't want to go crazy on that, but I think the most frustrating thing for me is when I'm reading a really nice proposal, but I'm struggling to find the components that I need to evaluate explicitly. So following instructions and understanding what people are going to be evaluating are, and giving people really good signposts for that is a particular thing that I think reviewers are doing this quickly. They're reading a lot of proposals. They have a lot of pages. You don't want them to miss, the really important components.
And one other, there's questions starting to come in the chats, but one other quick one is there's different feedback in terms of submitting articles. If like sometimes some of the advice people give is submit an article if it's like 90% ready. Oh, reviewers will help you. And even if it gets rejected at ASR or something, then it can go and use that. Would you offer that same kind of advice for grant applications, or should you submit it like when it's 100% ready?
It depends. I mean, for example, if it's an RFA, where it's on it's on growing socioeconomic inequalities in health. For that RFA, there was one call because it was an RFA, we were going to spend money on it if we got good applications. In that case, you should go for it if it's 90% there, I would say. I mean, with a lot of this stuff, it's sort of personal. I mean, sometimes, I'll talk with people and we'll say like, oh, I don't know if like they're going to have a problem with, maybe reviewers will have a problem with this. And then of course it's about something else. But if it's an IV approach, I'll say it's like always about the instrumental variable strength. But, it depends. And maybe it's about the stage you're in at your career. I mean, if you're going to go up for tenure in 2 years, maybe you really need to move on it, or something is happening in your life. I mean, there are a lot of considerations. I would tell people, I hate to be like less of an optimist, but always assume that you'll need to resubmit. So build that time in for yourself. But yeah, so it really depends. And some stuff though, like for example, like with the K applications, maybe you have a whole raft of publications that are going to come out pretty soon, and you're thinking about submitting a K. Maybe you go ahead and submit the K knowing maybe reviewers will comment on your publication record, because when you resubmit, all these 6 papers are going to be out, or something like that. So it depends, which is the worst answer ever.
Yeah, I mean, speaking from personal experience, I was planning an R01 submission in cycle 2, and a PAR came out with almost no time. And NIH is notorious for doing that to us. So it was a quick turnaround. It was pretty close to what I was going to submit. I just made some changes, and I just got it done a lot quicker. Fortunately for me, those PARs were under a different funding line. So I'm really glad that I put the application together and submitted it for the PAR.
Great. Amelia's answer to this next chat question was really great. So, is there a strategy, cycle 1, cycle 2, cycle 3, or just submit when you're ready? And it was clear, submit when you're ready. Don't hold for a cycle trying to anticipate the government's quirks or funding going up and down or anything like that. Just if it's ready, it's submit, and don't, if it's October 1st, February 1st, or June, it's send it when it's ready. Yeah.
Can I ask a question about sequencing? So if someone has already had an R03, they're about ready to wrap it up, would reviewers look askew on another R03 application from that person, or would there be an expectation that, next time it's an R01? And if it's not, like, why are you moving horizontally instead of vertically? Any thoughts on that?
I think it should be driven by the science. I don't know what you all who are reviewers think. I mean, a question I would have is, if you have a big idea, especially if you haven't had an R01 before, why not go for it? Especially with, a slightly better funding line. But, it's about the right activity code fitting what it is that you're proposing to do. I wanted to say, I mean, I look forward to the day where we all can be together, but see this at least, as like a starting place, the beginning of the dialogue, not the end. So please feel free to send me an email, share your ideas. I'll just say for myself, talking with applicants is probably my favorite part of my job.
Yeah, so Amelia, thank you so much for your time, expertise, being willing to chat with people, sending us your email address and so forth. I think everybody really, really benefited from this. Thanks everybody for signing on Friday afternoon in December. And again, stay tuned for further events coming up from the network. So really appreciate it. And everybody take care. Have a good weekend. And Amelia, thank you. Bye, everybody.